So with that, I'm passing the baton to Swati. She's going to be talking about how Microsoft measures the maturity level of onboarding. And just as a side note, I think this is like 4th or 5th talk from Microsoft. And every single time, I usually just get blown away by just the sheer scale of the problem they're solving at how many engineers is it now? 97,000 or something?
85.
85,000. Okay.
Yeah.
Approaching that 100K, right?
Yep.
Right? Yeah. So it's the sheer scale is just astonishing, and then things that they have to do to solve for that are just sort of like a North Star for many of us who are at much smaller organizations. So with that, I'll just pass it on to Swati, and I'll stop sharing.
All right, are you guys able to see my screen?
Do for me.
All right, cool. So hi, everyone. I'm Swati Doshi. I am a principal program manager at Microsoft. I'm part of the engineering at Microsoft Learning and Insights Group, or MLE for short. And we are very focused on doing deep data analysis. And our goal is to enable and empower groups in engineering to make insights-driven decisions for learning for engineers at scale. For this particular pilot, I am actually privileged to partner with multiple onboarding owners across various different organizations at Microsoft, as well as HR, to pilot this maturity model, which I'll be speaking about today. So going back to what Marco said about scale, right? So at Microsoft, new hires joining is an ongoing activity. It might ebb and flow within groups and within organizations, but when it comes to the company or enterprise as a whole, it's constantly on. Like at a given time, on average, we have 200 to 300 engineers entering our door every week somewhere in the world. So with that, as you can guess, there's complexity, right? The size has, because of the size, there's onboarding happening at multiple different levels. And varying groups are doing it. So for example, some aspects of onboarding are being driven by HR. Certain other aspects are being driven by organizations. And when I say organizations, I'm referring to like these big groups, which are dealing with cloud or dealing with office and things like that. And so we are talking about groups which at times can be 20 to 30,000 in size themselves. And then of course, that's too high level up, right? So there's also onboarding happening at groups and team levels. So there is programs which are much smaller, because obviously if you did something at literally a 30,000 foot view, then there's a lot of stuff that can get lost. So that's where these other programs come in. Right, so all of them are playing an essential part. There's a new person joining our company, and our goal at each level and each of the programs at the end of the day is to provide them a welcoming environment and help them get ramped up and get ready for the roles they've taken on. All right, so because the current efforts are so widespread, it comes with its pros and cons. So on one end, the onboarding program owners have a lot of autonomy. They have a lot of flexibility and an ability to make their decision on what works for them. Because the groups are, like I said, because the organizational groups are so huge, each one does have its own flavor, right? Each of them is almost at times like its own company. So it has its own flavor of what's needed. And so on one end, it gives them a lot of autonomy. The con side of it is it can also come with confusion and over responsibility or redundancies, because the onboarding program owner, she's left to figure out for herself, well, what all are the elements of my program? What am I going to focus on? What do I define as being in my program? And also, what does success look like? So that's the kind of, at times, the price that these owners are paying for autonomy. And we as a company are paying that, right? Because it also introduces redundancies at times when they could be sharing and learning from each other. So yeah, as we were talking to teams and groups and engaging with them, and had the privilege of being actually at a very high 10,000-foot view of what's happening in various different programs, we started noticing this, that one of the things was this pattern of not having standard terminology, clarity in requirements, any guidelines, common guidelines. Don't get me wrong. It's not like teams are like, go for it, you're all on your own. It is there, but when it comes to learning from each other, getting common standards and guidelines, that was what was missing. So that's kind of where we came in. A group of us got together and we said, let's put together those guidelines. Let's create a model. And the goal of this program maturity model is to, number one, provide them a common means of assessing their existing program. What's working, what's not, giving them some mechanism, means to understand where their program is at today, as well as provide them guidelines based on internal and external research data and other information we've gathered over the years from various different programs, especially the programs which are already mature, to then help groups make informed decisions on how to up-level their own program. So going back to what we were discussing about scale, right? So for us, for when defining the program maturity model, that diversity, that's the large scale, the scope actually was very helpful. Given all those many different programs taking place at various different levels, it was just data, 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 right? It helped us get so much of an understanding of what's working, what's not working, and above all, start to see patterns. Patterns are emerging in terms of what do good programs do? What is helping out? What's missing? What can we help them to up level? So we use that as one of the foundational elements of when creating the maturity model. That being said, I do want to acknowledge two other sources of information which was super helpful. One was obviously industry research data. There's so much data out there, both organizations as well as independent entities, as well as universities have spent so much time researching onboarding because it's such an important aspect of bringing in a new hire to your company that they have shared a lot of information. So that research data, along with certain companies, which third-party companies like Kaiser and Brandon Hall, they provide some information online on what they recommend for teams to do onboarding with. And so kind of bringing all those pieces together and especially looking at it from the Microsoft angle and customizing it helped us think about the model for what would work at our company. We were very conscious in keeping it, although we work with engineering, we were very conscious in keeping it discipline agnostic. And so far, we've been able to hold on to it because here's the good news. I'm sure there are certain aspects of onboarding that are specific to engineering, but there's a whole lot of things which are actually so common, right? When you're onboarding a new hire, there are certain things that different organization groups, irrespective of disciplines, are doing. And that's the commonality which is valuable for everyone involved, including people who are attending today. What I'm hoping for you, irrespective of the size of your group and the size of the work you do, that you are able to take away something from here. You're able to look at certain things we call out and you're like, oh yeah, that I could use. And then it's meant to be an assessment and a guide. So there are certain things that may not apply and you're like, yeah, good for somebody who's hiring like 200 people, every few weeks versus doesn't apply. I don't want to double click into that aspect of it. So that's what we are hoping, that the model applies across the board. And so far, based on the pilot data, seems to be holding true. All right, so let's go into the maturity model itself. So our maturity model has 5 phases. And they go from, early in-stage program, which is mostly at times ad hoc, quickly putting things together. And they would probably be at inception of phase 1 stage, which is inception, going up to beginner and going on so forth to a world-class onboarding program. So while phases are great, one of the things we will intuitively know is that there's not one singular thing that you do that's going to put you in a particular phase. It's not like, oh, we did this one thing and voila, our program just went from beginner to world class. There's so many other little things you're doing because onboarding is a whole bunch of a team which is involved in onboarding people and a large set of various different activities, training, sessions, and so forth that all come together to provide a great streamlined onboarding experience. So keeping that in mind, what we realized as we're coming up with the model was that while the phases are a great baseline, we have to divvy it up further. And so what we did was we actually realized at this point in time in the pilot that three categories stood out as the common categories. One about the different elements of the program, the other one about metrics and measurements that you are doing, and then the third is around content. And I'm going to double click into each one of them a tiny little bit to give you more context. So when we speak about the first category, which is program elements, we're actually speaking about these 5 different aspects of it. We ask program owners, the onboarding program owners, to assess their program in terms of what's the duration of their program. 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, how have they set it up? What's the structure? What have they done to set it up so that it's structured, or is it more ad hoc in nature? As you can guess, as they mature, the programs become more structured, more thoughtful, more intentional. Similarly, we remind them to look at what kind of a support team or community have they provided to the new hire. And now remember, not all of this needs to happen on day one, right? But the goal here is to help them think about it across the board. And all of these elements are both individual and interlinked. So for example, your program might be 3 months long or a week long. Maybe your program is a week long and all you provide them is a basic support structure. And then if your program increases in size, becomes longer, you're also able to enhance it and bring in other elements. And one of those elements, for example, is automation. I haven't met any team which starts day one with automation, right? Because they are too focused on getting the program set up. But then as they go towards the next stage, we remind them, so have you looked at what can be automated? Have you tried to bring in efficiencies? And that kind of can help them by bringing in efficiencies for common activities. They can then move on the program to mature and focus on other aspects of it that they didn't have time for. The second category is metrics and measurements. And we actually look at it from 2 angles. One is the metrics and measurements associated with your program. And again, when we say program, it's actually, like I said, multiple things, right? So we are giving trainings to them. We're talking to them about culture, maybe setting up sessions with leadership team. All of them contribute towards what's your program. So what we bring them back to looking at is, are you measuring success? Are you not only just setting these things up, but are you, one, as you mature, starting to get information and insights data back from it to say, was it good? Was it not? And then maturing further to say, well, great, you collected that. Are you using it? So how are you actually getting insights from what you did to circle back and say, aha, this works, this doesn't work, let's tweak it accordingly. So that's kind of how we help them look at gradients of maturity of metrics and by using metrics and measurements. Now, learning evaluation is the other side of it, which is for the new hire themselves. So great, you had all these trainings, you had all these sessions. The question now comes from the other side. Did the new hire learn something? Did the new hire actually, did it help them? Did it make them more productive? So learning evaluation comes from that angle, and it's a whole field in itself. So we have somebody in our group who actually, has a PhD in this. So that works out really well for us. So we are starting to dive deeper into it to help groups start looking from this angle as well. And then the last one is content. And in this case, I want to clarify, we are not looking at what your content is or dictating what your content is. That's let the teams decide what's right for them. What we are looking at it is helping them again assess from 2 angles, the delivery timing and the delivery format of vehicle. So by timing, again, usually when programs start up, they might have say they have 10 types of things to share with a new hire. And it might start with an ad hoc or fire hose approach, which is a common thing that new hires call out, that, oh my God, there was so much stuff that was told me, I cannot remember anything. Right? So we've heard that a few times. I don't know about your company, but I'll admit we've heard that. And so what we are helping them think about it is, are you being intentional? Are you looking at it as what delivery timing is it? Does this particular piece of information need to go out to them week 1, day 1? Or is there more time involved? And, kind of helping them look at it, maturing that they are thinking about the timing of the delivery by bringing in intentionality to it, and then kind of even going to the next stage or the world classes where it's the other way around. The new hire is dictating the timing of the learning based on what's the right thing and right time for them and where they are when they start this. And then vehicle is something we've actually just introduced. So I'm myself a little raw on this because we noticed, because of COVID and everything else going on, how much we all moved from just doing like in person most of the time to going completely online to now starting to move towards a hybrid. And so the goal of this particular subcategory is to help teams assess where they are, what they are doing. And essentially the end goal would be to make it so seamless that irrespective of the model, you're doing the same things and the same quality level. And for a new hire, it's seamless and they are still getting ramped up, onboarded, and learning without feeling the difference. So my plan was to use the Excel workbook that we are using internally as we go through the pilot. Just for clarity, our focus for the pilot was more on the content in terms of have we thought about the maturity model correctly? Have we categorized it correctly? Are the phases that we're talking about right? And so we focused on that. And to make it easier for us to get the pilot out, we essentially are using an Excel workbook right now. Not at all fancy, not at all, but mainly to get the thing out so that we can collect the most important, essential information that we're looking for. So here's the Excel. And because, as I mentioned, the Excel itself is just a medium for getting it out, I won't spend too much time on describing what all we are doing and all the different steps, but focus on the part that we are discussing, which is the different phases and the different categories and subcategories of the model. So let's take one of them as an example. So duration, right? We're speaking about duration. So let me set the target audience for this. So the audience for this is a program onboarding owner at a group level. And in this particular case for the pilot, we're thinking about larger groups at a CDP or a general manager level. So they have, the group size itself is higher up in the hundreds or at times in the lower thousands. But again, that's incidental because that's the population that we wanted to target to get data for the pilot. So when we ask them that question, so duration, you would see that owner come here and look at this workbook, look under duration and look at the definition of the 5 phases. And they would be like, oh, if my program is only doing day 1, and in this case, it's a very internal Microsoft terminology, irrespective of where you're in the world, irrespective of what kind of other onboarding is happening, there's definitely day 1 onboarding happening for anyone who joins Microsoft. So this is kind of to call out, if you're at that phase, you're that early on, then probably the only thing that's happening for you is that day 1. So then consider yourself as phase 1. And then as you go up in level, you could be having a 3-month program, you could have a 9-month to 1-year program, and so forth. So far, the industry data seems to indicate that generally programs in the 9-month to 1 year are in the quote unquote ideal state. We'll see. We'll find out. Part of the pilot is also learning from groups and learning from them what is actually working. So question for our group: what's your program duration in your organizations or group, irrespective of the size of it? What kind of numbers are you seeing? Is your program duration, say, a few weeks long, a few months long, a year long? And then you can just pipe in and just go off of mute and speak, or you could just put it in the chat, and me and Tomobi and Marco will keep an eye on it. One month, 4 weeks, 1 month, 1.5 weeks, 6 weeks. Varying durations, yep. 3-day company, organization, independently subgroup. Yep, that's kind of what we see in different places too. Followed by whatever the team does. Yep. So we are kind of at Microsoft also going through these different things. We have an enterprise, what I'd call an enterprise level program or onboarding that's done by HR, and it itself is undergoing some changes. And then there is the ones which are done by organizations, and then team levels and group levels. Awesome. Cool. Lots of different variations in programs, as would be expected. So yeah, so what we would do is they would go here, they would choose where they are. They're like, oh, we run about a 3-month program, and then they would select the duration. Now, in our case, these links on the left-hand side are actually links to SharePoint site. And so it gives a little bit more context on when you say your program is 3 months long, certain other information besides just what you're seeing in that one line. Similarly, we have, for example, another one we could look into is the new hire support team, in which case, again, programs which are brand new usually might have just a manager assigned, but if as program starts maturing, they realize we've heard again and again, new hires need buddies. So let's have a buddy assigned to them so they're not completely feeling on their own, and they feel like they have somebody trusted that they can talk with. And that's one of the, that's one of the things we promote internally, because there's so much research and industry data as well as internal survey information that keeps pointing back to new hires, saying what an enormous role a buddy plays in getting them onboarded in a much more seamless manner, and making them happy about having getting onboarded. So yep, same thing again here. They would choose what state they are in, and then they would. So this is how we do our. This is how we are doing the model. As I mentioned, the real learning for us was in terms of what all the questions they ask and everything. They're like, why is this only buddy, or what about that? And so we are, we continue to learn about the model. And today where we are is we are at the almost at the tail end of this phase of the pilot. So we did a multiple facilitated sessions with various different groups. We were very conscious about choosing groups that represent various different organizations, various parts in the from the worldwide Microsoft, as well as groups that are at various different scales. So we get a better sense of whether a model like this would apply or not, and what will still stand the test of time, and what are the things where we need to reconsider because it just doesn't apply as broadly. So yeah, so we are at that stage where we are almost done with collecting feedback. We got one of the decisions that really helped us was originally when we created this workbook. Our goal was to hand them the workbook and say, go ahead and fill this up, because everybody said they're so busy and they have no time, and let's just give them the workbook so they can do it on their own time. We made a very good decision early on after speaking with the pilot members. When we started introducing this and kicking it off and asking them, they said, could you do facilitated sessions? And oh my gosh, I'm so glad they said that, because it worked not only for them, it worked very well for us too, because there was so much that came out in those sessions when they shared and asked questions or said, oh, this is like, I actually remember in the emerging patterns, one of the really cool things that emerged was the aha moments, where they're like, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about my program this way. Oh yeah, we kept thinking as a structure, we hadn't thought about these 3 other things that could help us structure it better. And that was their aha moment, was our aha moment, frankly, like, aha, this is working. So the scaffolding and the guidelines we are giving, the structure that we are providing is helping them feel more informed, helping them feel like they know, have some guidance and are not just trying to figure it out by themselves. On the other side of it, the couple of other common patterns that emerged is, as we spoke to them on those phases, for duration, go and look at these phases, and for automation, go and look at that. One common theme came out is, yeah, you're telling us automation needs to be more mature. Could you give me some examples? What do you mean by mature? Like what kind of things would we automate? And this pattern repeated across groups and across what we called out. So one of our learning was we need to go deeper and provide more concrete examples. The second one was we were aware, and we are even more aware now, is after having done the pilot, that how do we straddle the simple enough that anybody, an onboarding program owner, isn't spending hours and days to fill up and assess their program, and yet having some degree of complexity and nuances in it that they can be more pick and choose versus just have everything be a linear phase model. So that's still a struggle. so now that's our job to do once this part of the phase of the program winds up, to start figuring out, can we do those 2 things, or do we just leave it simple enough because it's still fundamentally stronger and better than where they were, so that it at least enables the teams to move forward. All right, so now we flip over to you. So this is our program maturity model. And what I would love to do is, address any questions you have, and frankly, also any suggestions. Because if you're running programs and you've learned something, or if you look at these categories that are on the screen and you're like, oh, but have you thought about this other one? I'd love to find that out.
Hey, Swati, Vidya asked a really good question, which was, how do you help make the experience seamless for new hires across time zones, as it relates to being geographically dispersed? And is there a part of the model that addresses how the program deals with people onboarding that are in different time zones?
Good point, Chris. Right now, no. We haven't thought about time zone, but I can see that it won't become an individual element there, but I can totally see when we look at the examples and we look at things that teams need to consider in some of these, the structuring of the program or one of these subcategories, that's where it might come in as calling out that aspect of it.
Thank you, Swati. Yeah, for us, because we don't have that many NH, like the scale is much smaller, even within US, trying to get a decent day of day full of activities that are still, you are not crouching all over somebody's lunchtime. It's kind of hard, and there is always unhappiness about that. So I was wondering, how do you try to kind of mitigate those kind of problems?
You mean it's hard to quote unquote steal that time from the new hire? Is that what you're saying, so that they can be onboarded?
Yes.
So the struggle is real. I would be lying if I said, oh, that's it's so well done at Microsoft. But here's the thing, what we are all leaning towards as we understand how important onboarding is, some groups are already ahead and some are, kind of joining in making sure that there is a safe, there's a time period allocated for onboarding, and that is time that is meant just for that. Right? It is okay for groups, and that realization comes with time, Vidya, right? So first everybody thinks, oh, but I got a new hire and there's so much work, and let them start. But over time, groups start realizing, but in the grander scheme, if somebody's going to join your team for years and join your company for even multiple years, giving them that initial, whatever it is, 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever it is a drop in the ocean. And it makes such a big difference, and it takes time, right? It's hard to convince, and that's kind of one of the reasons why I can say this, because what happened is it's all this industry data, not just that, but it's internal data, right? Surveys that we conducted, information that we got that helped us start seeing that pattern and picture, that not only are onboarding owners saying that we need more time, but the new hires are saying, I felt like I was fire hosed. I felt like I couldn't understand because
I
there's
hear
so much
that
thrown at me,
so
right?
many times. Fire hosed.
Yes, exactly, right. So that's kind of where it's the two things are coming together, and that's where groups are starting to understand and imbibe and truly understand we need to give this more time.
The one thing I would add here to that is that, I mean, the managers are key. You've probably heard, many of us say that. And part of the fire hose sort of phenomenon is, okay, I'm only going to give you this much time, and then we got to put that person to work. So we're gonna fire hose them, not effective, right? They're not going to retain that stuff, right? You're going to pay now, or you're going to pay later. And paying later is more painful. And getting the manager and leadership buy-in to have a long-term view in their mindset and belief system that we're going to take the time to carefully, bring this person up to speed, so that they are going to be a long-term effective asset. So we pay up front less than we would pay over time if we've ineffectively brought that person up to speed.
It's basically slow down to speed up, right? And that takes, it's so hard to convince. And so to that point, and Alexandra, I see your hand, give me just a moment. I'll just close on one thing for Vidya. One of the things we are doing is I actually co-own an engineering onboarding network community, and we are, the information that we have, we're actually helping the onboarding program owners to take it back to their management team, to their leadership team. And so that also works, right? So it's like we have all of this awesome information, and we are now actually bottling it up and giving them so that they can go share it with their management team to say, here's why, which groups have seen success, and here's why, here's why they're running into problems. So that also kind of is in itself helping them make a case for spending more time on onboarding.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Alexander.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Oh yeah.
Cool, thank you. And this is actually a very interesting topic, and one that, I remember came up a lot, at least for us at Twitter. There's this sort of tension between what are you onboarding people to? Are they being onboarded to their job, like their function, to their team, to their org, to the entire engineering sort of culture? And if you ask the local manager, they would want him as quickly as possible working on their problem in their local sort of micro optimal way, versus like an engineering leadership who may want people who are more nimble and sort of able to move across the organization as the sort of priorities shift. But on the flip side, if you don't take them in the beginning, and you allow them to like drop into their team, then you sort of like lose ability to influence them later, at least not in an onboarding way. But if you like give them too much right initially, then they feel fire hosed. So there was this sort of tension between how do you onboard into the larger sort of context, but do so in a way that doesn't overwhelm them, and sort of not, and also like, accommodate managers' needs. And resolving that balance is, I've seen to be a pretty big challenge. I'm sort of curious to see if you see it that way, and if so, how do you think about that at Microsoft?
So similar issues, right? Is the pull is from all directions, exactly like you said, both in terms of what to share, what to onboard them on, as well as pull them in to start, being part of the group. And so at Microsoft, we have different groups at different places. Some of them have invested heavily in freeing up the time for the new hire, so that they have the ability to get onboarded in a more, initially also giving them more ramp up time and onboarding time, and as well as make the program longer, so that there are other elements of onboarding that go on. And then there are other programs which are still in the struggling phase, and to figure out how to give that time out. So one of the efforts that is underway is to do that streamlining though. So the way I would look at it is now the need to convince that this is needed has reduced. So that's actually our tipping point at Microsoft. That earlier they used to be like, we have to, and now it's like, oh yeah, we know we need to. So as a result of which, it is becoming quote unquote easier, take it with a large grain of salt, but it's becoming easier to then start thinking about streamlining it. So that's kind of where we are going, where teams are starting to, across at an enterprise, organization, group level, starting to think about who comes in where and how does it fit in. Chris?
Yeah, just to add to that, when we think about program length, there's sort of the person is dedicated to the program for a particular period of time, and that's all they're doing, and they haven't moved to their, day-to-day job, if you will. And then there are other program links that are sort of they're a participant or a cohort in this particular thing for a longer period of time, where they take a break from their job for signature events and training activities and community things over the course of a much longer time. And so the revamp of what Swati talked about company-wide used to be a very sort of orientation benefits related day and a half kind of a thing out of the gate, to a year-long over the course of the first year of an employee's time at Microsoft. They get a much more comprehensive immersion in what does it mean to be an employee and the culture of the company in various aspects, where there's spacing, for them to reflect and then come back and get some more. And that would be sort of the foundational layer. And then, the next biggest piece would be an organization, bringing them into the Office organization, or, the Azure organization, and what you need to know to work, in general within the organization. And then kind of the third layer, I mean, you could break it down to even more, but the third layer would be that local team and the specific technology you're working on, and working to try to have all three of those layers working comprehensively or cohesively, so they don't feel like they're getting hit by multiple sides that don't talk to each other, but rather there's some coordination of how those things land, so the experience is not fractured but somewhat reasonable, and again, it's spread out over a number of time.
Right. And frankly, that is the other arm of this maturity model that some of us are starting to work across the enterprise organization and group levels to start figuring that out so that we can lay it out a bit better and help groups again make that determination too. Who comes in week 1 and who comes in week 2, and also what aspects of it come in at what time. I saw Ben had raised his arm. So before we go, I just want to double check. Did we address whatever it was that Ben you're looking for?
Actually, I have another question I could ask. You did address the initial one for sure.
Okay.
But as the yeah, I'll turn on my video. Yeah, so I was curious, like how to approach thinking about like program. I don't know if the words like interconnectedness or integration, but in other words, like how a program connects to another program. You know, in terms of like I don't know, overlap, not necessarily overlapping content, but I guess just like how does one program maybe you know, leverage or depend on another program?
Could you give me an example? It might help me.
Yeah, sure. So now just thinking about like let's say an engineering onboarding, and it's very important to the organization that that engineering onboarding includes like you know, DIBS, like diversity inclusion training as well. And so like, you know, just being able to map like, oh, there is yeah, I mean,
yeah, like there are two aspects of bringing a new hire online and helping them get familiar with these things. And how do you connect the two, right?
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Actually, yeah, that's actually a great question, Ben, because that's one of the things that we have been talking to pilot teams about. In a sense, here's one interesting thing. So first to address your question, at Microsoft, we are lucky enough because of the scale and scope that certain things like community engagement or, you know, having various different, there's hundreds of communities and new hires can join, and communities, whether technical or non-technical, right? And then there are already predefined diversity and inclusion training and accessibility training and a bunch of those already that are taken care of by quote unquote different groups, right? And then comes the onboarding part of it. So for some of these predefined training, there is also predefined times, and they are not like they usually have a buffer time period in which somebody can get it done. Some of them are mandatory and annual. Some of them are once they join. And then there is things that groups are doing here, right? So one of our learnings as we're looking through this, so we were aware that that's happening, right? Because we already know that's happening at Microsoft, but within that there are certain things which our groups are doing as well. So we were aware of that, but as we went through the pilot, what we started realizing is, as we were speaking to program owners about the structure of their program or the community engagement part, this came out where they said, well, we don't consider that part of our onboarding program, but we know as a fact that's happening in our group. So how do we look at it? What do we do? And we're like, that's a good point. Like, it is happening, right? So the key thing is, when you look at your onboarding program, you're looking at it as a whole to say, these are the things that should be happening for the new hire over a period of time. Are those activities happening? Are those engagements happening? Are they being introduced to the community aspects of it? Who does it is a bit more immaterial in this particular case, right? As long as it's done well. The way we are looking at it, and we are advising the pilot groups also, is to say, well, that's happening. Are you looking at it? Maybe one angle that you might want to look at, especially when you go back to the metrics and measurements part of it, is maybe you look at it as, are they being given to the new hire at the right time? So if there are like lockstep things that are happening, and a new hire comes in, and in week 1 they were like, oh, go do this diversity inclusion training, and they're like, I feel lost. I don't think I'm ready for it. So that could be one way for them to look at it and ask the question from that perspective: is the timing right for the new hire? And if it's not, that's still happening. But now the two program owners work together to say, yep, let's do it. But if as the onboarding program owner, will come back and let you know, here's a list of people who are brand new. Let's move this out and change the delivery timing a little bit out so that it's more streamlined for them. Does that make sense? Does it answer your question?
Yeah, it's getting a lot more thoughts. But yeah, thank you.
And Marco, I know you'd raised your hand as well.
Yeah, I had a question, and by the way, I love this. I love the fact that you're measuring the maturity, right? Like, and you can only improve something once you start measuring it. So kudos to you to even like thinking in terms of that. So that's super awesome. My question is, how do you reason about discovering where, like, say you have two programs and one is more mature than the other, right? Do you now drop in and consult the one that you can improve the maturity of? So it's basically you as a consultant helping of a specific team or program, or do you create a community of program owners where they can also learn from one another? In other words, democratizing that sense of like up-leveling program owners.
Marco, you read my mind. So what happened is that's one of the learnings of the pilot, right? That as we were talking to these groups, so here's the pro and con of a facilitated session. On the plus side, that's some of the information that came out. We're like, oh, you're looking for XYZ, and you are a more, like because we had a diverse set of programs, some of them are more mature about something and some of them are not. And we started seeing that as a pattern, like, well, let's get out of the way and help them talk to each other, right? So that was one of the learnings. But at the same time, they were saying that some of this came out only because we had facilitated sessions and we had these longer, deeper talks. So we have to, this is a work in progress. What we are trying to figure out is a combination of how do we still provide the same value and quality that we were able to with a facilitated session without doing facilitated. And at the same time, however, these nuggets of knowledge and information that came out beyond just them choosing, oh, I'm at maturity level 4 and I'm at level 1, but more in terms of where they chose that information, getting granularity enough to say, aha, oh, so you are at phase 4, you are great at, you've automated XYZ. How about you, we are kind of play some role, but both basically try to get out of the way so that you guys can find each other. So there is something on those lines that I'm experimenting with right now because of this learning.
Got it, yeah. And I just wanted to point out, I think Andrew had a question about scaling the program teams.
And I think it ties in with, what you were just talking about. It's like, so some programs you could really, if you doubled the number of people that were going through it, you'd need to double the number of people delivering the program. But I think what you were just talking about is it like, if there are ways that you can, whether it's like automating some things or relying on like more of a decentralized approach where you're just connecting people, and so you don't necessarily need to have double the number of facilitators. But if you can automate it and you're like, oh, okay, you need to connect with someone who meets these criteria, then the scaling is a lot easier. It's
an interesting question, Andrew, because if you think about the seasonality of onboarding, and typically when college hires come in, August, September, like right about now, we've just had a huge inflow. If your program, isn't able to handle sort of scaling, then that would be less mature versus no, we can handle higher or lower volumes based on the time of the year, and we're set up to do that. Perhaps that's another pivot or axis on the structure of the program elements. I mean, is it already something that you have built in, Swati, or is it something that maybe the ability to scale, the maturity of being able to expand or contract volume is part of what you talk to the team about?
Let me think about it. How are we doing? So I remember, I'm vaguely, so let me answer it more transparently. First and foremost, scale isn't super high on our radar right now because one, we are early, and this is one of those elements that we have to consider. And the second is we will actually, this is a great question to take back to see how many groups have to think about scale and how many groups are already well set up, because in certain groups are at a point at Microsoft where it's, the total number of members stay approximately same, so they know predictively how many new hires are going to come, and others are like gung-ho and like it's like okay. So that's a great point. We are not dealing with it right now, but it's actually a fantastic thing to check out with the teams and think about it from that angle.
Well, and on that point, there has been a huge pain point of teams knowing how many people are coming, knowing how many people have been hired and having the data. And so a huge effort that Swati and team worked on was to work with HR to open up access to the reporting and data so that onboarding teams have the visibility so they can plan. And they know how many folks are going to be coming over the coming months and weeks so that their program can be ready for it, which was just, they were blind to that before. So they didn't even have the data. So that's kind of where we've been, and we've just now opened up access to that.
Actually, a follow-up question to that, which I've seen a lot of in the past is acquisitions. Like when you're acquiring a company, and you now have to basically have an influx of hundreds, potentially, or thousands of people, and you have to onboard them, but that requires potentially different take on it. They may need to be customized to some degree to contextualize things, but at the same time, you want to be able to track it. Is that a part of your model at all?
Yes. So one part of the model, definitely, as we show them the gradients of maturity of your program, take them through that to say, so what that's that support team or community engagement aspect of it that we say. So what at Microsoft, for example, one of the things that is dealt with already by most of the groups is early in career folks. So because we know, right, they are fresh off from universities, so they are new to everything, including working in a company. So that was recognized very quickly as how do we address the needs of early in career? How do we give them support? How they form cohorts and all of that. But the other aspects which have pockets of success and pockets of maturity is around industry veterans joining, or people joining from acquisitions. And so that is one of the aspects that we explore in the model to remind them, what are you doing? And what, phase one is early in career, phase two is industry veterans, and so forth, right? So, because that's kind of, this goes to address two things. One, we have it, but earlier when I was speaking about the simple enough and yet complex enough, this is one of the things where it's not necessarily linear. Right. So that's one of our learnings. It's not like we did early in career and only then did we do veterans, and because you could be doing multiple things at the same time. So how do we still address that they're doing it and give them the knowledge for those who are not to go and do it, and for those who are to give them enough granularity to assess that as something they're already doing.
And Sasha, the mergers and acquisitions is an interesting area at Microsoft if you sort of track it over time, because we used to acquire lots of companies and we would fold them into the Borg, we'll call it, and we would kind of screw up the cultures of different organizations. And there's a number of documented cases of that, you could read about. And more we are doing limited integrations, right? Where LinkedIn is a separate company, part of Microsoft, and they retain their own culture and their own leadership, their own HR, their own onboarding, their own learning. GitHub is another example where that was handled that way. A lot of our game studios. And so as a result of that, the mergers and acquisitions team does handle some of the onboarding into Microsoft because you're just part of the overall cultural thing. But they retain their own sort of stuff, in which case they're still kind of responsible for, for onboarding. And they're not really coming fully into Microsoft. So you're not really having to fully onboard them.
Yeah. In fact, Chris, to that point, one of our pilot teams is Minecraft, which falls in this exact same category where they are Microsoft, and yet Minecraft is an individual unit. And so that's kind of what we're trying to see. And luckily for them, this still worked, but we did learn from there to say, so how do we handle the distinction that's needed for acquisitions and an aspect of onboarding which applies very specifically to them. And then Chris, I saw your notes, the activate the onboarding community to help each other. And FYI, by the way, Chris is my manager, I'm already working on it. So I'm updating I'm actually working with someone to get one of our tools updated so that when we are, as I mentioned, I co-own the engineering onboarding network, and it's a community. And when people join, by the way, in case this is helpful for you, one of the things we do so it's a community for onboarding owners. It's not for new hires, it's for onboarding owners to help them make, work and collaborate. And so one of the things, the tax that we ask them to pay, it's a small one, is we ask them a few things. What are you doing? What are your pain points? What are you trying to solve? Where are you at? Right. So, and potentially this maturity model is one of the questionnaire they answer later on. But right now we ask them a bunch of things. And so what I'm working on is, based on the learnings from the pilot, starting to ask them what is their area of maturity, what areas do they think they're working really well on, and starting to ask people what is the areas they need help in, because that's what my hope is, that the patterns start emerging, and hey, you guys can find each other. And so we don't need to, they don't have to wait on us, because one of the worst things I feel is if we become a hindrance or a block for anybody, if they can solve it for themselves. I love the self-service model. So that's kind of what we're working on.
Cool.
All right. Yeah.
Other questions? Anybody else? Any questions?
I'll just make a comment for potential future exploration. This idea of maturity models is something that can be applied to a lot of different things, not just onboarding, continuous education, growth and development. In fact, at Twitter, we were trying to apply it to documentation. And so I'm curious in the future to sort of explore that, to see if anyone else is sort of putting these kinds of structures for self-serve structures of proficiency or maturity, if you will.
Totally. I love that, right? I mean, even as we were doing this, we were like, the individual elements might be different, and they should be, right? But there are certain aspects that might be common, as well as the concept, right? So I was, in fact, just last week, I was approached by somebody else running not the main onboarding program, but something else. And they said, could we apply this to ours? And I'm like, why not? Let's figure it out. So I'm in fact going tomorrow to talk to in their meeting, and we are going to discuss and see what aspects of this are actually applicable as is and what aren't, so that we can kind of, hopefully with some minor tweaks, apply another model for them. Totally agree with you. I love it. And Marco, I know we are at a few minutes past 12. How are we doing on time? We good?
Yeah, we're doing well on time. I'm curious if anybody else has any questions or comments on this. Otherwise, we can start wrapping it up either way.
Yeah, I have one more question. I guess thinking about like program maturity, I'm also thinking about like content staleness, like especially considering like, if you have a library of e-learning or documents and stuff, like I would think a more mature program would somehow have less stale content and more evergreen or something like that.
So I wonder if this is what you're referring to. So when I was talking to a colleague about content delivery timing and delivery vehicle, she brought up basically the same thing to say, and Swati, where's your question about the freshness of the content and relevance of the content? And I'm like, aha. So I actually have a note that I made in my internal notes to say, is that a category by a subcategory by itself, or where does it come in? Because a very good point, right? I mean, both of you noticed that one of the elements that we suffer from is we have a lot of content, but the flip side of it is a lot of it starts getting stale very fast. And whether we can provide some guidance, as well as, in fact, kind of nudge groups in terms of maturity, being that you have figured out a way to keep that content fresh, and employing some of the common tactics, right? Usually the common tactic is the newest person who joins refers to it, looks at it, and if they find something missing or something that is stale, they go change it, and that kind of continues, right? And we talk about it, we don't always do it. So maybe that's what we do. Good catch.
Cool, thank you.
You do have on the delivery vehicle, what's the modality, right? Is it a hybrid? Is it online? Is it like
And one interesting another aspect of maturity model is that it's not static. Like, it's something you can continue to reevaluate because of that drift, right? Like, is it, you may score high one time, and the next time, because of drift, you're no longer, as highly mature.
True. That is true. And the other side of it is, as things evolve, right? Like, for example, delivery vehicle wasn't even on my radar when I started this, and then COVID hit and other things happened, and then it suddenly became like, damn, so we better be considering this as something that teams actually plan for, right? So agreed. Yeah, totally.
I think Vidya just had a question. When you talk about content freshness, do you have process set up to affect the freshness based on metrics? So is there a feedback loop to actually do something about that, right?
I would, sorry, go ahead, Vidya.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant was like, is that something that you let each program owners or the teams decide, or you have guidelines? How do you make sure that that's happening? Because otherwise, what's the point of having the matrix, right?
Yeah. So when it comes to content freshness, like I called out, it's not been on our radar as one of the topics. So that's something, given recent conversations, that we'll consider whether that's another element or a subcategory we have to add. And then to answer your question though about refresh based on metrics, I have noticed that some of the more mature groups in Microsoft are already doing that. So they are using that the feedback loop from their new hire, right? To ask them that, like they have surveys and questions that they ask new hires, and some of them are asking that as well, to say, was the content relevant? Was the content useful? And as part of that, if they come back saying, well, I don't know, man, this looks like multiple years old, then that's the intention, that they can use that to refresh the content. So yeah, the answer is, because of the scale, it's a touch and go. Some groups are doing it, others are not. And that kind of brings us back to, should we add it as part of the model so that it's a nudge and an encouragement to groups to also keep that as high and relevant on their radar.
And it sounds like as you create this community of program owners, you can cause that sort of learning from one another that's going to make everyone better by sharing best practices with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. We have found it very helpful from that angle, now that we have a defined community and sharing, right? When we formed the community, we actually went through a process of interviewing a whole bunch of teams and asking some questions and trying to understand what the pain points are and what are the areas that they're looking for help on. And that's where, like I mentioned at the very initial when we started, redundancy, right? We started seeing patterns, right? Team A said, we spent a lot of time trying to figure XYZ out, and so did Team B. We're like, wow, wouldn't it be great if, since A finished before B, if they could have shared it, because then the other team could go on top of it, right? Enhance it so that others can benefit as well, instead of reinventing the same wheel. So that's part of the goal, and that's been actually very helpful. One of the most strongest feedback we get is the shared resources, that it's been so helpful to just get what others have done, because they can then always just go build on top of it.
Cool. Well, with that, I just wanted to thank you, Swati. This was super cool. I keep going back to the sheer scale, right? You mentioned at the beginning, you onboard monthly close to 1,000 engineers, right? Like this is you monthly onboard what's the size of a unicorn in Silicon Valley, right? Per month, right? It just blows my mind. Congrats. And there's always something to look up to and learn from, people who are like way ahead of us. So super cool.
Yeah, and I would be, and that's why I called out that just because we are looking at scale doesn't mean it doesn't apply to you. A lot of these things, irrespective of your size, are things that you can pick and choose, right? You can say, well, we are smaller, our needs are different, our scope is different, and then choose what you'd be like, oh, but we really want to look at support team, and what are we setting up for a new hire? Sure, go for it, right? And you look at something else like learning evaluation, you're like, I'm going to look at it, 2 years from now. That's okay.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Swati and Microsoft, for I think this is number 5 or 6 presentations. So always super, super great to have you.